Continuation of Chapter 7. Bad Laws. Consider the current laws concerning divorce, abortion, these laws that destroy marriage and the family. They cannot compel. One must disobey them. The same thing applies to ecclesiastic laws. If they command things contrary to the good of the Church and the salvation of souls, they are no longer laws, and we cannot submit to them. The same thing pertains with the current reforms. Their effects are baneful, yet it was foreseeable because they were contrary to the tradition, to all that had previously been done in the Church. Was it necessary to believe that our predecessors had been wrong for 20 centuries? Impossible. Their laws sanctified souls. How is it possible to make new laws that are the opposite? It used to be, for example, that a marriage between a Catholic and a Protestant was not permitted unless the two spouses signed an agreement stating that they promised to have the children baptized and brought up in the Catholic religion. Now, this is no longer required. Here is something unthinkable and contrary to the faith. It concerns the salvation of the souls of children. It is inconceivable that the Church could decree such laws in the so-called spirit of ecumenism. One does not barter the Catholic faith to please Protestants. There have been clearly bad legislators in the Church who have caused immense damage. How, for example, could the imprimatur have been accorded to the new catechisms? This is another effect of bad laws. For no one has the right to give children bad instruction, such as is found in these modernist manuals that denature the true religion, call into question the virginity of the Blessed Virgin, and omit original sin. How should we submit to laws and obligations so contrary to the good of society, the Church, and souls? Let's continue the reading. Quote, "If then, by anyone in authority," the Pope does not limit the statement to the civil authorities only, "something be sanctioned out of conformity with the principles of right reason, and consequently hurtful to the commonwealth, such an enactment can have no binding force of law, as being no rule of justice, but certain to lead men away from that good which is the very end of civil society." End quote. The Church was instituted for the salvation of souls. This is the first law. Any law contrary to it is null and void. True liberty postulates law. Quote, "Therefore, the nature of human liberty, however it be considered, whether in individuals or in society, whether in those who command or in those who obey, supposes the necessity of obedience to some supreme and eternal law, which is no other than the authority of God, commanding good and forbidding evil. And so far from this most just authority of God over men diminishing or even destroying their liberty, it protects and perfects it. For the real perfection of all creatures is found in the prosecution and attainment of their respective ends. It bears repeating, we possess freedom in order to choose between means that are ordered to the true end. But the supreme end, to which human liberty must aspire, is God." End quote. We have no right to do anything that leads us away from God. Should we do so, we would not be exercising our freedom, we would be abandoning ourselves to license. It is necessary to grasp the distinction. License permits itself anything. It means to do as one pleases. Liberty, on the contrary, is the power to act in the order of the good. This is what the Church has always taught. As Pope Leo XIII reminds us, quote, "The precepts of the truest and highest teaching, made known to us by the light of reason itself, the Church, instructed by the example and doctrine of her divine author, has ever propagated and asserted, for she has ever made them the measure of her office and of her teaching to the Christian nations." End quote. The new law of the gospel. Leo XIII does not fail to mention the superiority of the new law promulgated in the gospel by our Lord. Quote, "As to morals, the laws of the gospel not only immeasurably surpass the wisdom of the heathen, but are an invitation and an introduction to a state of holiness unknown to the ancients, and, bringing man nearer to God, they make him at once the possessor of a more perfect liberty." End quote. The Pope then chooses a beautiful example of the true liberation ushered in by the law of the gospel, the gradual abolition of slavery, not by violent revolution, but by the true fraternity of men in Jesus Christ. Quote, "Thus the powerful influence of the Church has ever been manifested in the custody and protection of the civil and political liberty of the people. The enumeration of its merits in this respect does not belong to our present purpose. It is sufficient to recall the fact that slavery, that old reproach of the heathen nations, was mainly abolished by the beneficent efforts of the Church." End quote. There are those who have taught that slavery had not been suppressed thanks to the Church, but only in the 18th century thanks to the revolutionary principle of liberalism. The truth is that, while the Church could not at once alter the organization of society as it was at the time of the conversion of Constantine, which, unfortunately, had its customs, nonetheless, bit by bit, by its influence, the Church delivered men from these inhuman bonds. For example, in Africa, the custom of buying women exists. Upon first arriving in the country, one is indignant. What a disgrace! But to change things is not so simple. The bishops of Cameroon tried to react against this incredible traffic by eliciting from Christians, and especially from the catechists, the promise to set a good example, that is, that they marry or marry their sons without paying money to obtain the wife. What happened? The women were so accustomed to being bought that they had such an ingrained feeling that the more one paid, the more they were worth and esteemed, that they thought that if their husbands had not paid anything for them, there was no real bond between them. They felt that they were not held in esteem by their husbands, and so at the first quarrel they could leave. The result, the marriages did not endure. The bishops had wanted to do the right thing, but it turned against marriage itself. Such interminable discussions followed. One has to know not to go too fast. In fact, the only thing that can change mentalities is conversion. Several centuries of Christianity are necessary. If one asks why the Church did not suppress slavery from the time of Constantine, it is necessary to realize what would have happened to the slaves, suddenly deprived of their master, who gave them a wife, food, and afforded them a roof and clothing. they would have been completely lost. Where would they have gone? Many would have returned to their masters. Of course they worked. They were not free to come and go as they pleased, nor dispose of their own persons. They were absolutely attached to the house, serfs. But to change that, it was necessary to act very gradually, prepare minds, and refrain from giving slaves their freedom until they could exercise it legitimately for their good. Returning to the consideration of good and bad law, the Pope explains that, quote, "Moreover, the highest duty is to respect authority, and obediently to submit to just law. But where the power to command is wanting, or where a law is enacted contrary to reason, or to the eternal law, or to some ordinance of God, obedience is unlawful, lest, while obeying men, we become disobedient to God. Thus, an effectual barrier being opposed to tyranny, the authority in the state will not have all its own way, but the interests and rights of all will be safeguarded. The rights of individuals, of domestic society, and of all the members of the Commonwealth, all being free to live according to law and right reason, and in this, as we have shown, true liberty really consists." End quote. Having thus clearly shown the relationship of law to liberty, Leo XIII can conclude, quote, "If when men discuss the question of liberty, they were careful to grasp its true and legitimate meaning, such as reason and reasoning have just explained, they would never venture to affix such a calumny on the Church as to assert that she is the foe of individual and public liberty." End quote.